Good morning, and welcome to the Newport Baptist Church online service. I'm Pastor David Listener, and I'm glad that you've taken a few moments to join us for worship. Today we're going to continue our study from Psalm 90. So if you have a Bible and you'd like to turn to Psalm 90, verses 9 through 10, would you please do so that we could join together as we look at this very potent passage of Scripture. Life can be very difficult, and we sometimes wonder why. A buddy of mine loses his job, 3 weeks after he finds out that he and his wife are going to have a baby. A woman I know is diagnosed with MS, as she's trying to raise, her children and, put some extra money on the table. We hear about accidents and illnesses, foreclosures on homes, businesses that go under. And now today we have this virus and, people are struggling with the depression of being at home. There's the uncertainty of what's the future going to hold. What's school going to look like? Are we going to be doing more of these online classes? How are we going to negotiate with, remote work and staying at home? How is everything going to play out? And all of this uncertainty has created a high level of stress. And we're asking the question, why is life so hard? And we see here in Psalm 90, verses 9 through 10, that Moses observes two very potent points here. One is life is bitter, and number two, life is brief. But there's a reason behind that. We're going to look at that today as we explore the passage. So let's read Psalm 90, verses 9 and 10. It tells us this: Our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80. If our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. And Moses here is really reflecting on the fact that we are, in some respects, under the curse that we read about in Genesis 3:17. And when God said to Adam, after he had partaken of the forbidden fruit, that by the sweat of your brow, you're going to have to earn your bread and work the land, and it's going to become hard for you, and it's going to produce the thorns and the thistles, and life is going to be tough. It's going to be an uphill climb. And from the moment we come into this world until the moment we leave, we find that to be very true. You come into this world kicking and screaming, and as a young child, there's the bumps and bruises and falling down and skinning your knee and whacking your head on tables, and as you head through school, we run into the social issues. Young adults have struggles trying to figure out how to what to do with their lives. Parents are wrestling with the stress of paying electric bills and staying up all night with their children, and dealing with fevers and doctor visits. And then we get older, and we're back in diapers again. Our knees fall apart, our teeth fall out, and we're going through this constant grind, whether it be our health, it could be social, it could be financial, relational problems, depression, anxiety. We go the gamut. And our years, it says here in the passage, end with a moan, and it sounds so depressing, but it's true. How many times, have we just had this heavy sigh in our heart over the fact that somebody at work got the promotion when we should have been the next in line? How many times we have this sigh in our heart when we think to ourselves, okay, I've got a few extra dollars in the bank and I'm going to take my family out to a movie or out to dinner or just do something nice with my wife, and I'm driving home and suddenly I get a flat tire, and now I have to take that extra $100 and replace the tires in the car. How many times do we have that moan within our hearts as we're in bumper to bumper traffic, and we just have this sigh because I'm going to be late to work and I'm not going to be able to take some time at lunch to make some calls and run some errands because I've got to work through lunch now. And this is life. We lose sleep. We see the injustices, the nepotism. We see the weather affecting us sometimes. Just a damp, dismal day, puts this entire damper on the rest of our week. Disease and illness. This all comes crashing together, and it creates this sense of hardship that we have to endure. And Solomon in Ecclesiastes, in a couple places, reflects upon this. He says, "What do people get for all of the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless." And think about that. How many times have you and I have lost sleep at night because we're thinking about work, or we're thinking about our kids, or we're thinking about, why is it that test score was lost in the mail, or why is it that the doctor lost my medical records and now I've got to go through another MRI. This is the type of stuff that keeps us up at night. And Solomon continues. He said, "This too is a grievous evil. As everyone comes, so they depart. And what do they gain, since they toil for the wind? All their days they eat in darkness, with great frustration, affliction, and anger. Ecclesiastes 5:16 and 17. So why is life so difficult? Why are we under this wrath? What's the purpose? And I believe that what we see here on planet Earth is that God is giving us a taste of heaven, but he's also giving us a taste of hell. He gives us a taste of heaven, and we see some beautiful and wonderful things during the course of our lives. Newborn children coming into this world, weddings and friendship and a good laugh with some buddies, a sunrise, the foliage in the fall, watching a piano recital, or, your daughter doing a ballet piece. There's some moments in life that are absolutely exhilarating, and we see this tremendous sense of good here on this planet. But we also see a lot of bad. There's people, battling cancer and viruses. They have, broken cars and broken relationships. Folk have been abandoned. Kids are left by the wayside. How many of us have been betrayed? And the list goes on. And we see a lot of evil and a lot of wickedness just the same. And I believe that what's taking shape here is that God doesn't want us to get too attached. If life was just so easy, we would have, an inclination to ignore God. I mean, think about it. We can get very attached to our vacations, our sports. I mean, think about, in the fall, how many people go to their new Coliseum to watch their favorite team. And, there's nothing wrong with watching a good football game, but how many people live for that? I mean, how many people live for their hobbies, getting out on that bass boat, or, being able to, get together with friends and go on a trip? How many people live for personal achievement? And, all their life they revolve and they think constantly about, making it up the ladder one more step. What do people live for? And, Paul was exhorting us in Philippians to live is Christ. And if you want to save your life, we find in Jesus' teaching that you have to lose something here. And there's this entire shift. There's an entire paradigm that's being turned around when we think about the fact that to follow Christ, we can't really get too attached to this world. And I think God intentionally has allowed life to be rough. And it may even get rougher for some of us. And I think that's the entire point Moses is making here, that life was designed after the fall to be rough, so that we would have a different set of priorities. And we'll build on that in just a moment. He also says life is brief. Some will live to 70, maybe 80 years old. It's a painful journey. But I ask myself the question, why? Why not 200 years? Why not 300 years? Why 70 or 80? And we find that time flies. You wake up and before you know it, 2 or 3 years have passed. I mean, this coming Friday, I'm going to be celebrating my 27th anniversary. And those 27 years have just flown. It just seems like yesterday I was standing at the altar there and exchanging vows. And, I've asked myself the question, why does God want life to be so brief? I mean, it's certainly bitter, but the brevity of it all, what's the purpose behind that? And the answer is found also in the book of Genesis 6:3. Bear in mind the context here is the pre-flood era. These are the antediluvians, as they would say in theology proper. This is the era here right before God destroys the earth with the flood and Noah's Ark and that whole story. And it tells us that the setting of the flood is one of extreme wickedness. I mean, people were exceptionally bad. They were involved with all sorts of debauchery, and the Bible is very clear that they had become so evil that God was going to limit the span of a person's life. And it tells us in Genesis 6:3, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because also he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years." Now, this is sort of a ballpark figure. We see a few characters in Scripture live a little bit longer, and certainly many live a little shorter. But we find here that there's this parameter, this boundary being put on human life. And the question is why? And there's really two reasons behind that. Number one is it keeps sin in check. Think about the context. You had people that were leading exceptionally terrible lives, and it keeps that entire sin factor in check. Think about it in this light. What if Stalin was allowed to live another 20 years, or Hitler, or Mayo? What if some of these megalomaniacs in history we're allowed to continue on just even a little bit longer. It keeps that sin in check. It also, the length of time keeps hope alive because there's a sense of finality to our suffering here on planet Earth. So one, it keeps sin in check, and also it keeps hope alive because there's a sense of finality to what we're going to be enduring here. So God intentionally keeps life bitter, but also he allows it to be brief. But we need to learn and ask the question, well, what can I take away? If life is bitter and brief, what do I do with all of this? Here's where I think Moses is going, and Jesus builds upon this in the Sermon on the Mount. Prioritize the eternal over the temporal. I think this is where the whole concept of a short life and a struggling life brings us to the point where we're called to prioritize the eternal over the temporal. Listen to what Jesus said in his teaching here on the Sermon on the Mount. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's Matthew 6:19-21. And here's the point. We were not made for this current world. We see in the book of Hebrews that those who are walking by faith, who are following after God in the Old Testament, were, quote, looking or longing for a better country, a heavenly one. C.S. Lewis comments on this in his book Mere Christianity when he writes, if I find myself in a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And I believe this is what Moses is thinking about here. He's reflecting upon it, that we were not made to stay on this planet ad infinitum. We were made for another world. And God has designed this world with these prickly trials, if you would, so that we do not set our hearts and our affections on today. We are called to set our heart and our affection and our minds and our desires on eternity. Because if you think about it, if you live for the moment, you're going to be overwhelmed with the stressors of life. Sure, I need to be concerned about my work. I need to be concerned about my children. I need to be concerned about my health and school and my home and, taking care of the plumbing projects and making sure, my car is tuned. Those are all important things, but it's not our greatest priority. And if we make the temporal our priority, we end up putting everything in life in a completely unusual and poor perspective. Think about it in this light. When we were living down in Texas and one of the Star Wars films came out, it was going to be aired, I think, at midnight. And there was this guy who had a job, and it was a night job. And he asked his boss if he could take some time off to go see the opening of the Star Wars film. And the boss said, no, we need you here. You could see it another time. So the dude quit his job. And you think to yourself, that's nuts. He turns around and he quits a good paying job just to go out and watch a movie. It has something to do, and it speaks volumes about his priorities. And in fact, when he was interviewed in the newspaper, he said he had to get his priorities straight. And everybody's scratching their head saying to themselves, what a nutcase. You're thinking just for this moment here, what about, paying your rent and your electric bill and, buying food and, paying your car insurance and using that job for some good here. And we see that disproportion. We see how things are taken out of context. And this is exactly what we do when we live for the moment, when we live for today against the backdrop of eternity. See, if we live for eternity, that will help shape our behavior today. If I'm thinking about what's going to happen after I die, it's going to help me get through the grind right now. Because suddenly, when you think about the proportion here, I'm here on planet Earth for what? A brief period of time. It's going to be bitter, it's going to be tough, but eternity is massive in comparison to the moment. So the stress about work, about the virus, about peer pressure, about the favoritism, even the stress of death begins to subside when I start to think about the eternal. Because what happens is that when I start to think about what's going to happen after I pass away, it affects how I live right now. My prayer life, whether I'm going to share my testimony, invite people to church, show hospitality, everything is recalibrated when I begin to think about the eternal and I set my heart on eternal things versus temporal things. Let me share with you a tragic story, but a good one nonetheless. There was a woman that I knew of many years ago who wanted to experience the sensation of flying. She wanted to experience the freedom of floating through the air. So she went out and she got higher than a kite. She climbed up to the third floor of her dormitory and she jumped. And for a moment she felt the exhilaration. She felt the freedom. She felt the wind, flowing through her hair and her hands. She had that rush and that euphoria. And then she felt the sidewalk. And a few moments later she felt the sting of God's judgment as her eternal fate was sealed. And she was forever separated from God. At her funeral, everyone said, "What a waste. What a sad tragedy. What a horrible loss." But let me ask you something. What's the difference between her life and ours today? What really is the difference? It's just the amount of time it takes for us to hit the sidewalk. Because today, if we're living for the temporal, if all we're thinking about is satisfying my momentary needs, my momentary wants, my momentary desires, to have that quick thrill of euphoria, whether it be shopping or going to a bar or heading out and having some sort of a vacation or trip that I'm living for, what's the difference between her and us except time? And against the backdrop of eternity, a few seconds or 70 or 80 years, it's nothing when you think about eternity. And this is why Jesus stepped in to time and space. This is why Jesus came onto the scene. This is why God understood that life for us would be brief and that life for us would be bitter. And he sent his son. And Jesus said it in this way, "I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly." And through Christ we could have a hope. Through Christ we have a future. Through Christ we have a life worth living that truly possesses a sense of meaning. Not just meaning here on earth, but eternal meaning. Because he came to redeem people. He came to wash us of our sin. He came to reconcile us to a holy God by offering himself as a sacrifice on the cross, so that through his death and his resurrection, those who place their faith in him would have that wonderful hope and that assurance that they will spend eternity with him. And suddenly the entire perspective changes. Suddenly everything looks different. Suddenly my problems that I'm going through now are minuscule relative to the eternal, when my focus is upon that which is truly important, that which is going to last forever versus that which is exceptionally temporary, which is what I'm going through right now. So if I learn to set my heart, my mind, and my affection and my efforts on the eternal, the struggles of this life, the struggles of this world will suddenly grow very strangely dim in the light of his glory and his grace. So I hope and pray that you found some encouragement and hope for the struggles of life through today's message. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a text or an email. Get in touch in some way, shape, or form. I'd love to interact with you. But I do hope and pray that you join us again next week. Have a great day, and God bless you.